What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, a competitor's guide to mental health and mastery, your resource for conversations about your mind and how it affects everything that you do. Down Dog Athletics' mission is to help people bridge the gap over to things like yoga, like meditation, and mental health so that people can fuse what I call the light and the dark side together. So most people understand the need to win, to go harder, push longer, get stronger, really burn both ends of the candle. But there is another side too, and I'll help you incorporate that. Before I get into today's guest, I want to share a few things. One, head over to downdogathletics.com. Sign up for my weekly newsletter. Stay updated on the blogs, events, podcasts, and other educational content. Been having a weekly yoga class and small group training in Seattle, and that's been going really well. People have really been loving that. So if you're in the Seattle area, be sure to sign up so that you can get that there. And then you have the blogs, the podcasts, all the events that's going on, all in one email. Send it out every Friday to wrap up the content so you can have everything in one place. Secondly, if you haven't already, grab my free 28-day plan where I combine yoga, training, nutrition, and give you some mental health tips. Basically, I want to educate yourself on how you can get a little bit healthier. And lastly, if you're looking for coaching, feel free to reach out, shoot me a message on social media, or just fill out the application on downdogathletics.com. Without further ado, today's guest is Sam Miller. You might know him on social media as Sam Miller Science. There's a lot of talk about stress in the mental health space, and this podcast covers a lot of that. But stress also affects your hormones and metabolism. Sam has become a leader in the industry when it comes to hormones and how the metabolism works. In this episode, we talk about stress and how it's actually good for you as long as you can recover for it. Sam's got a really cool analogy that is similar to the phone and how we have drains and charges on our body, and we got to balance them. There's going to be two keys that impact your capacity to manage stress, and Sam dives into how stress impacts your physiology and your ability to reach your physical goals. Super excited for this one. Here we go. What's up, Sam? Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, man, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I connected with Sam through Cody, another mentor and guy that I follow and listen to. And Sam's one of the smartest guys. I mentioned a lot of the stuff in the intro that he's done and that he's known for. But I'm super excited for you guys to have him on. Sam, I'm really excited for you to be on and kind of just drop some knowledge. And I think the first place I'd love to hear your story is how you got into starting Oracle Fitness training and nutrition, and what the catalyst was for that.
Sure. So what was interesting is I didn't really necessarily set out specifically to create a company at the time. I actually, I went to undergrad, kind of always was personal training in college, had some online clients even after school, ultimately went and got my master's and worked in the corporate world for a little bit, and was in kind of this time of transition, both in my life and with the business. And so Oracle Training and Nutrition was just kind of evolved from one of my nutrition clients who would just call me he's like, you're kind of like my fitness oracle. Like I just come to you and I like have these questions and you answer them. So that's where that came from, is just kind of derived from that relationship with that particular client. And I, decided, I needed a name. I didn't think that I have a very generic first and last name, Sam Miller. So ultimately I was like, all right, let's roll with this. This kind of works. I like the way it sounds. And it was just, the meaning, not necessarily I think there's like three meanings if you look it up in the dictionary, but the second one is basically just a quality or reliable source of information. And one of the biggest challenges in my own fitness journey was finding that reliable source of information, finding quality information that you could make decisions off of, that wasn't changing all the time, or even if it was changing, there was some form of rationale or uh, level of understanding that was conveyed to the audience. And so for me, it was very important to be that trusted source for my clients, and then also for anyone who's kind of following along that was trying to receive information or material from myself or from my brand, or ultimately from the coaches that we work with down the line from there.
Okay, cool. That's a cool story on how it started. When I first saw Oracle, the first things that I think about is either 300 or Halo. I don't know if you're familiar with either of those oracles, but
yeah, definitely.
it's
they have like Oracle of Delphi and stuff like that. So
yeah, the logo is super cool, and I like that it came from, it wasn't something that you came up with. Someone kind of gave it to you. You mentioned finding quality information was kind of a struggle for you at the beginning. Was there a time when you were trying all sorts of diets or training methods that now, looking back, you kind of chuckle a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think back to kind of the classic like high school male scenario, which is, maybe you pick up a copy of Men's Health or something like that, and nothing against that particular publication. I think it's a great thing for many people who need to get in shape and just need somewhere to start. But
Yeah.
for me, I was a very highly active teenager who had had a traumatic brain injury with which like caused some pituitary stuff for me. But then you combine that with the fact that I'm playing sports, I'm lifting, and I'm now following a diet designed for a 40-year-old male who has a beer belly and needs to just drop like 20 pounds and get healthy. So I think it wasn't necessarily that the information was always bad. It was just that the information wasn't specifically targeted to an audience, or it wasn't clear. Hey, like nutrition and fitness are these very, very individualized concepts. And so, one thing that I kind of pride myself on is like we've never done like a nutrition template. Like everything is, hey, what's your day in your life look like? What does your activity level look like? What does it look like, for you in terms of stress or your family? Do you have any pets? Like all of these things ultimately make you who you are, but also it kind of goes into how your nutrition plan should be created, how your fitness plan should be created.
Yeah.
And so for me, just making sure that that information was out there, like, hey, this is a diet for free in this magazine, but like this is probably best geared towards a 220-pound person who's also like 5'8" and needs to lose weight. And it's not a muscle building or athlete diet. It's like specifically for one thing. So definitely don't want to throw anyone in the fitness industry under the bus per se, but I think where we try to it's a double-edged sword, right? Because generalized information is a great way to take a very unhealthy sedentary country with a lot of diseases unique to Western culture and ultimately improve them. But then I think there's also the caveat that when that information isn't customized and it's put in hands of people that don't have a lot of education around a topic,
Yeah.
it can potentially have consequences that, why do so many people need a reverse diet that are, under eating and doing, something like Orange Theory or CrossFit?
Yeah.
There's nothing, CrossFit can be good if you're eating appropriately, recovering appropriately, but if you're combining the right training with the wrong diet or the right diet with the wrong training, it's like without that periodization and planning, you can end up with a whole host of different, health problems.
Yeah, it's kind of like when people say just move or just work out or get off the couch, which is that first hill to climb, which is kind of like what
Right.
the Men's Health thing does. But what people don't realize is there's a lot of different hills to climb, and you got to study up and get educated on which one's right for you. I'm
Sure.
curious, with your pituitary issue, was that something that affected? I know the gut produces like a lot of melatonin. I think it's the pituitary gland that does as well. But did that affect your hormones to a level that caused you to get super into the science of that, which is kind of what you're known for now? Or did you have to have a specific diet specific to what was being affected by that injury?
So not necessarily specific diet. We just know that like anytime you have an injury or inflammation in the body, obviously it makes sense to really control sleep, training, nutrition. I just found that like exercise and nutrition were one of the best ways to create stability in my health and in my
Yeah,
life. Um, so the so you mentioned melatonin and the gut and things like that. So melatonin is produced by the pineal gland, which is
that's
different than
right.
the pituitary gland.
Yep.
But it's for me it was definitely a number of different factors. It wasn't so much that like um I guess for the purposes of like this particular podcast, since my like health stuff could be, a whole book probably. It did sort of affect some things, but not so much from like having a healthy level. It was more that I would be more sensitive to changes because of so when you have an injury, right, or trauma, it's your
Hmm.
body perceives external stress or internal stress. So I basically had what they call heterogeneous enlargement of the pituitary. Basically, you have swelling inside your body in a gland or organ. Just like if you had swelling, like if you're a football player and you need to get, a cortisone shot or whatever to deal with whatever you have, that swelling is perceived as a trauma. It's perceived as stress, and the body reacts a certain way to basically, deal with that. So for me, it was basically like my body was already perceiving some level of stress on the inside.
Mhm.
So how can I control my practices, and a lot of the things that I do now to basically keep my physiology in a really stable place? It's not necessarily that like it really depended on the doctor in terms of what the sort of prognosis was, but ultimately I was able to alleviate some of the stress and create stability and basically improve my blood work and reduce some of that. Also time is a huge factor too. Like anytime you have a concussion, you just got to like give it some time. Mine was like pretty significant, snowboarding, and ultimately, they take all the necessary precautions from that just to make sure you don't have internal bleeding or anything like that. But
Right.
yeah, for me it was mainly just, and it's the same thing I teach now. It's ultimately by managing stressors, by managing that stress inventory, managing your practices. And I know you get a lot into mindset as well. That ultimately is one of the first steps in managing physiology, and that will bring you towards your physical goals. So for me, just like a lot of younger guys start out, like I wanted to look better, be stronger, and athletic and all that good stuff. And so ultimately, until I was able to understand my physiology, like I wasn't really able to move closer to those physical goals. And that's why I created, what I currently teach now is I call it the P3 model, which is basically that our perceptions and our practices ultimately influence and manipulate our physiology. And then that physiology is basically the precursor to reaching the physical goals you want. And so if you're a coach listening to this or in your own fitness transformation, the most important thing to really understand is like you may come to a coach with a goal of like, hey, I want abs, or I want my biceps to be bigger, or maybe, the ladies out there, I want my legs to be more toned, or I want a nicer butt, or I want abs, or I want to look good in a swimsuit. All of those things basically are preceded by what's going on in your internal health and internal physiology. Calories influence that, sleep influences that, exercise influences that. There's so many different factors, but the first step is controlling that inventory and those factors.
So when you're saying inventory, that's like emotional, physical, um, and like mental inventory as well? Or are you
Yeah,
breaking
yeah,
those out?
really everything. So for like mental and emotional, I would put that under, in my model, the way I teach, under perceptions. So
Okay.
perceptions could be your relationship with food, it could be your relationship with other people, it could be your relationship with yourself, because obviously having a growth mindset, having a positive viewpoint on your transformation is a huge part of that. So those fall neatly under perceptions. So out of the P's, we have perceptions. Practices are like your daily habits, routines, and rituals. So that
Okay.
would be actual, like literal physical inventory. Like how many steps do you walk in a day? How much do you lift at the gym? What's your training volume like? Like what do you practice physically? So we have physical inventory, we have mental inventory, like perceptions, and then ultimately, from a physiology standpoint, the way that we take inventory is through biofeedback. So how much sleep are you getting? What do your labs look like? How's your digestion? What's your hunger, cravings, appetite, recovery from the gym? Are you setting PRs? Those are all great signs of like how our physiology is responding to something.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned that in a recent post where like calories in, calories out, or just the simple reps and sets is the bare, like maybe not the bare minimum is how you put it, but is this what you were talking about when it's like this is that holistic, very
Right.
detailed approach to getting to know someone so that you can actually help impact their life?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, calories are really important. Don't get me wrong. Like energy balance is kind of where we start with things, but it's not always where you finish. But you have to remember it works both ways. So, like our hormones influence our hunger, they influence our sleep, they influence our training, which then likely will influence how much you want to eat or how much you need to eat to support recovery based on your body size, activity level, body type, all that good stuff. And then conversely, calories consumed directly, is one of the primary factors in manipulating the thyroid. So when you eat the right amount versus not enough, those stimulate our body and our forms of perceived stress or lack of stress in their own way as well. So definitely, that post is kind of alluding to the fact that, yeah, calories matter, energy balance matters, but it's just one component of this whole way to view a person. And there's really a lot that goes into it, right? Because you could notice, like, okay, this relationship with food is why you deprive yourself of food, which is why,
Right.
and you're over exercising. And we need to fix that mindset, fix that relationship. But then we also need to understand how maybe reverse dieting, which is going to influence your physiology, is actually going to bring you closer to this physical goal that ultimately you're seeking, right? Whether it's muscle gain, fat loss, anything like that.
Yeah. I think the relationship with food is one that's really important. I like to say, pizza doesn't club baby seals, and bananas don't save the day. It's
Right.
the the relationship that you have with food, with yourself. These are all things that you're speaking to, that when you see calories in, calories out, and it's like, oh, it's 80-20 or 90-10, the rest is hormones. And it's a very simplistic thing. But what you're looking at is the environments that people are putting themselves in, the mindsets that they have, which I think is really cool for someone that is just getting started with you. Is this a long process to really kind of change these things? Because you can't just take yourself out of maybe you're in a relationship, and that's part of the reason why you have a bad relationship with yourself. And I know it's training and nutrition, but it's not like relationship advice. So how do you go impacting someone's environment, someone's mind at a level that's actually going to change their identity?
Right. So it's definitely a slow and steady process, and you still have to stay within your scope. So even though I talk about perceptions, like if someone truly has an eating disorder, I would recommend them to either an eating disorder specialist, RD, or like a counselor or licensed therapist that specializes in that sort of thing. So, very important to consider the totality of the situation. Uh, Usually, these types of things, though, like don't really, if you're lucky and you have a really good intake form and you ask great questions on your first few calls, some of this is going to come out in the first few weeks. And then there's some stuff that some clients you don't know until you're 12 weeks in and you hit an obstacle, you hit a barrier. But
Yeah.
ultimately, as those things come out, that's what sets you up to like have a client for life, or to really have someone that like, is alongside you in your journey.
Yeah.
So, with that relationship stuff, I think you have to be careful, whether it's relationship with food, whether it's with exercise or anything else. I think a lot of it is like, something that I'm working on is just getting, I'm still learning about this, but getting better at like motivational interviewing and understanding where someone's coming from, asking the right questions, just really getting in the mindset of the person that you're working with, and understanding that, what they perceive versus what you perceive can be two very different things. And sometimes, it's not figured out, like in the coaching journey. Like there's an issue there, it's maybe discovered or maybe it's not discovered, and sometimes you have to be okay with like letting that go, that it didn't quite get resolved even with the first coach. Like
Yeah.
I have clients that come to me, I might be their third or fourth coach, and I'm just now the person that's discovering that, oh, so you actually, always eat, all your calories at night, and you actually have this really atypical sleep schedule. Because let's say like another coach had, total hours of sleep on a check-in and like total calories and macros, but you're not like diving into specifics. There's lots of stuff that can sort of fall through the cracks, especially for folks that have very high client volumes. It's
Yeah.
nothing really against those coaches, it's just the structure that they chose to operate their business. I find that like as you get into those finer points, you really start to see, like you start to connect the dots a little bit, like, oh wow, so eat a pint of halo top as your calories, but then your digestion is like super whacked out the next 2 days. You just start to sort of like connect the things. It's like, okay, so why are you choosing to do that if you know this food like destroys your gut, even though it's quote unquote healthy? There's just a lot that plays into it where you have to sort of zoom out. I've been fortunate to solve a lot of those problems and to help a lot of people with those issues, but I can't say that we get there every single time.
Right.
Part of it is like the person has to be open to sort of being in that self discovery, being on that journey, and being open with you, and really having some growth minded conversations, and making those revisions to their life.
Yeah, for sure. The motivational interviewing, I think, is a really good point. And at the personal trainer, coach, or really anywhere where you're trying to get people to level up, I almost wonder if having a background in psychology, I know personally, like I've tried studying that so much because understanding where people are coming from, even just having awareness of it is so helpful. Is that something that you mentioned motivational interviewing, or is that something you've dug into as well with kind of understanding the mind specifically?
So I definitely have done a fair number of readings when I was like, or a fair amount of reading, excuse me, when I was like putting together the P3 model and how perceptions truly fit. I wouldn't say I'm like a expert on it. There's definitely folks who know way more about
For sure.
psychology than me. It's actually kind of ironic that you mentioned that. It's happened to be dating a PhD in like basically mindsets and health behavior change. And so she's pretty much an expert in
Yeah, it's a great combo.
motivational interviewing, motivational interviewing, and like understanding the client journey. So for me, I'll be honest, like I'm learning a lot about that right now.
Yeah,
Previously, I definitely did some digging in terms of mindset work, but a lot of it too for me. So I actually facilitated a few leadership development programs for companies based in this area. I've done like stress management, uh, productivity type presentations for some corporations. Red Hat was acquired by IBM. I did a rotational leadership development program for them, for their higher level managers, senior directors. And then for LinkedIn, we did like a stress management and sleep kind of
oh wow.
day, like an immersion for them. And so in those, typically what we're learning is about like a lot of it goes into personal development, mindset, time blocking and structure, and really that type of organization which can contribute to someone's ability to grow on a day-to-day basis. But those questions are still something I'm getting better at. I would just say for the coaches listening, like ask open-ended questions, get really intentional about listening. Improving your communication skills is always going to be helpful.
Yeah,
And then from like a client relationship standpoint, just like I think the biggest thing is like being an advocate, being supportive, and there's a way to motivate your clients through questions as opposed to just like rah rah, you got this, good job,
yeah,
way to
let's
go on
go.
this week's check-in. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, you're not necessarily just a cheerleader, you're also a coach, but you're also I think the biggest takeaway for me or theme in this area, especially like this part of the podcast, is like how can you best serve as a mirror to sort of reflect what they're experiencing so that they come to the realization themselves, because
yeah,
ultimately if you're always influencing them to come to that decision, if you're always persuading them or like twisting their arm to get them that way, as soon as you're gone and they don't check in with you every week, you really, to use the old analogy, like teach a man to fish versus giving a man a fish.
yep,
If you haven't really taught them that proper mindset, or help them cultivate that mindset, as soon as they're done working with you or they end their like coaching obligation, they're kind of on their own and their chances of being successful have changed drastically. So I always encourage coaches to reflect, be that mirror as much as they can, and help kind of guide people through it via you know we can be a compass, we can't be Google Maps. So
yeah,
if you have a client, you can point them and show them where north is, but they're going to, like you said, I think you use this analogy with the men's health thing, is like everyone kind of has a different hill and we're kind of all starting in a different place in terms of our health journey. So that would be like me telling you like, hey, here's how you go north, this is the direction of your goals.
yeah. But I'm due
But
west.
yeah, or if you're like following the Google Maps that I used to get to my transformation goal versus where you started,
Mm,
following that step by step is just because I added 200 calories or I did a 5 day a week training split, or because I operated a certain way or did certain movements, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to work for you. And I think that's something that's really important too. So kind of being really reflective, asking the right questions, and then remembering the difference between kind of that, especially from a mindset perspective. Coaching mindset for one person is going to be completely different than another. So that's where like the compass versus Google Maps thing comes into.
yeah, I think to that point, it's like that's where awareness kicks in, and whether that's getting feedback yourself or um, for me, like meditation and journaling is a really good way to get that awareness and just kind of that perspective and that change in perception. I'm curious with the everything we've talked a lot about stress and leadership, but
people that are in high profile positions, or people looking to grow, people looking to start their own business, to some degree, stress is a good thing. Stress is why we get bigger muscles. So what is that kind of tipping point that you found where stress is beneficial? And then when stress does become harmful, what is it doing at a physiological level for men, especially? And then you can go into women as well. I know that's like 3 questions in one, but sometimes as I
Yeah.
speak, it just kind of all comes out.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, that's like three questions in one. And just while we segue, so if you are interested in mindset stuff, I have to kind of give the plug since you asked me and I'm not the expert on it.
Absolutely.
So Casey Joe Eats Well on Instagram, for mindset, health behavior change, all that good stuff
I'll be
is
sure to link to
the way to
that
go. Yeah, yeah,
on my,
definitely link that one.
is it a KAY
Yeah,
or
it's Kasey.
SEY?
And then
Cool.
I can send you the link too.
Sweet.
Yeah, so Casey Joe Eats Well for the mindset stuff. As far as for me and the hormones and stuff, I would say that stress is good as long as you can recover from it. So whether that's like
Okay.
mental stress, returning to a parasympathetic state, sleeping, training stress, those are, our body is very adaptive. So from a physiological perspective, we're meant to handle a certain volume of stress. This is also why some people can have really, really high training volumes. Like their maximum recoverable volume is absolutely absurd compared to other individuals. And it's because their body is adapted to that stress. They've been able to recover from it. And that stress is ultimately what causes muscle protein breakdown. But the way that they eat, the way that they sleep, and their other practices have ultimately allowed them to trigger muscle protein synthesis, and they built muscle as a result. So these are like very, very key differences here. So stress can be good so long as you can adapt to it and you have the recovery resources in place to recover. And you have the bandwidth essentially when you think about it. So I teach drains and charges as like if you think about like a split column, I tell clients, if you can charge your iPhone, like you can charge your body with kind of a
Mm-hmm.
parasympathetic approach. And so really when it comes down to it, really the only things that aren't stressful on the body from a training and recovery standpoint are sleep and food. Training is stressful. Um, trying to increase training volume or intensity, any type of training is stressful. The problem is in our society, we've uncoupled stress with movement, whereas pre-industrial revolution, pretty much anytime we had a stressor, it was coupled with movement, which is
Mm-hmm.
what our body's adrenal response is designed to do. We have catecholamines, we have neurotransmitters, we have cortisol. They basically are created to stimulate and break down energy to free it up for our body to go into action. However, you getting a stressful email or reading a stressful text on your phone or having a stressful phone call seated in a cubicle is completely decoupled with movement. So now you have your body creating this level of physical preparedness and alertness that really otherwise, like in a movement based setting, whether it's gathering food or protecting yourself or you're in a fight, super, super helpful. We're very alert, we're very responsive, our body's primed.
Yep.
But when you're sitting at a desk, that does you absolutely no good. Now you're just triggering this response, ultimately releasing this energy that you're not going to really use. It's kind of this like nervous energy, right? That's going to sit there while you're not necessarily like moving, burning calories, all that good stuff. So stress isn't inherently bad. It's like our ability to manage it, recover from it, and then also what we're doing when we stimulate the stress response. We want to be stimulating it for the right reasons. So if you're stimulating stress coupled with movement, that gives your body the opportunity for physical adaptation, whether that's walking, doing more steps in a day, lifting more weight at the gym, doing all these different things, or if you're an athlete, like improving your sport, or if you're a runner or a cyclist, maybe like condensing the amount of time that your efficiency within a given activity. So stress, I think from that perspective, I try and teach it. It's like it's your recoverability from stress that's so key, that ultimately is sort of moving us in that direction. I think you mentioned men and like how stress starts to impact men and women from a hormonal perspective.
Yeah.
And really what happens, so we've got a couple of things from a metabolic perspective. Stress impacts our thyroid conversion. Stress can impact the gut and the liver from both a metabolic perspective and from a like inflammation perspective. And so as a result of that, we have impaired conversion of T4 to T3 that impacts us metabolically in both men and women. Cortisol also in men inhibits cholesterol transfer in our so basically in our mitochondria, there's this little protein called star protein that is steroidogenic regulatory. It's basically a regulatory protein that regulates the transfer of steroids, which in our body, things like, testosterone is technically in a family of like a steroid or androgen. So cortisol will impair that in men. As far as in women, we're seeing a whole bunch of different things, but usually what ends up being a primary issue is that stress really is influencing the thyroid in female health. And because women are designed from a like biological and anatomical perspective, females can bear children, whereas men, don't get pregnant. So because of that female anatomy, there is some level of sensitivity when it comes to keeping the body safe and making sure that mom and baby can like be fed, and that a woman who would be pregnant ultimately has like the food and resources available to like carry a baby to term and then ultimately breastfeed after that. So when you start to have lots of stress going around, whether it's like environmental toxicity, lack of sunlight, lack of food, lack of sleep, any of those things can start to trigger these cascades of like stress reactions, which then the body, for example, in that case, let's say there's like less sunlight, less sleep, less food, we're going to downregulate the thyroid. It's what Dr. Tita calls like metabolic winter. It's basically the body is conserving energy. So our body's super, super smart. So it's really not hormonal dysfunction. It's like our body is functioning in the way that it was designed to function for survival.
Yep.
And unfortunately, it's like we're doing today's work in 2019, going on 2020. And, we never got like a system hardware reboot. We didn't get new.
I love that.
We never got new physiology, right? Like
Microsoft, we needed a new one.
Exactly. Right. So you could be podcasting, like, whether it's on a new Mac or PC, whatever, like we're still using like, an old like 1996 Gateway or Dell computer that's like the size of your entire desk. It's unfortunate, but that's just how our body was wired, and we have to learn to sort of work with our body in that way. Even over the course of time, like, over the past couple hundred years, like we have cell phones now, we carry around these super powerful supercomputers that emit blue light. We never had that 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And so within the last 100 years, did our adrenals, did our optic nerves like really adapt that quickly to deal with that? And the answer is no. Our optic nerves still understand light as a signal to be awake. So if you're staring at a phone all the time, really all you're doing is just like triggering those optic nerves, which then lowers your melatonin production, sleeping less. And then, as I mentioned, that plays a huge role in like recovery and stress and hormones and things like that.
Yeah, to that point, phones 10 years ago, the iPhone came out, and this could go a whole different direction, but just want to touch on too. It's like from an anatomical standpoint, like we weren't designed to be in so much flexion. We weren't built to sit in cars and at our desks and be hunched over at our phone. So, that's another thing just to think about for everyone listening. I love that you touched on the thyroid and everything else. One quick question before we shift gears. Do women or men have a higher capacity for stress? I read an article, or as a study, saying that women had more endurance and could last longer in training bouts because they recovered faster. But I'm wondering if that's tied to stress, capacity for stress.
So anecdotally, and also like a little bit in the research, typically women, unless there's been a change in research, the last I looked at this was probably a couple years ago, women can perform typically more repetitions at a lower percentage of their 1RM, whereas men can typically perform more repetitions as you move closer to 1RM. From like a coaching perspective, I use a lot of like RPE, perceived exertion, intensity, kind of daily training max kind of mindset when it comes to that, as opposed to always using set percentages. So when we're thinking about it in a lab environment, my understanding is that that is true, that women can sort of do more with a volume perspective and recoverability perspective. I've seen this with like female, whether it's a bikini competitor or CrossFit athlete, there seems to be something about women and training volume as opposed to
Hmm.
training intensity.
Got it.
However, I'm definitely not the expert on that, but I can certainly speak to my client experiences and what I've read from people who study it, like in a lab. I think the capacity to handle stress also comes down to the individual. I try not to think of things in gender boxes or specific like general roles, because the truth is that ultimately our mindset and our resiliency towards stress and our training volume is largely a product of our environment and how we were, you know, were you an athlete as a child? Were you a gymnast when you were younger? Did you play a sport? Did you have a lot of responsibility growing up? All of these things ultimately influence our ability to handle stress regardless of gender. So you might have a female who's great at handling stress, a male who's not, or you might have a male and female who are really great at handling one type or another. I think usually the exposure to stress plays a huge role in our adaptability and our physiology and how we're responding
Okay.
from that perspective.
Cool. Appreciate your perspective on that. You mentioned that you got a master's, but was that a master's in something outside of science and training and nutrition?
Yeah. I actually was enrolled in a dual degree program, a JD MBA program. So I have an MBA, which is obviously more of a business degree, but I have a bachelor's of science. So after the bachelor's of science, and kind of when I was doing the MBA, I was working in more of a corporate role, and then my job after that was corporate, and then I ultimately transitioned back into the health and fitness industry. So a lot of the I wouldn't say, I'd say that's where like the leadership development and the business and corporate wellness side of the health industry fit nicely with my advanced degree. But for the most
Right.
part, a lot of the physiology stuff we talk about really doesn't relate too much to my, even the folks that I do interact with that have those types of degrees. A lot of it is like that information changes so frequently, like neuroendocrinology and everything like that. There's just, you kind of just have to study it and and use things like, PubMed, National Institutes of Health, hire coaches, work with people who are experts in the field. And fortunately, I've had some really awesome mentors, really awesome coaches. I also I read a lot about it because as we talked about earlier in the podcast, I kind of had it impacted me personally, and for
Yeah.
whatever reason, I was noticing more and more clients coming with that issue. So I got my first certification when I was about 18. I'm 30 now, so over those 12 years, like there were definitely clients coming in waves that I started to see some of those endocrine issues, but I don't really have like a master's in hormones or endocrine. I've definitely done a lot of certifications, a lot of functional diagnostic nutrition trainings, and live events, and a lot of mentorship from um, things like meeting with functional medicine doctors or people who do more integrative nutrition, and paying to work with them or paying to like go to their events and learn from them, seminars, things like that. Is probably, I really gleaned a lot more from that than obviously my master's degree, which is in a different field.
Absolutely. I'm glad you spoke to that, because I think one of the biggest problems that people struggle with is the story that they are not credible enough. Have you ever struggled with that self-doubt of like, who am I to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly didn't even know what I knew until probably like 2 years ago. People can serve in different capacities in your life, and I was fortunate enough that I was becoming surrounded with peers who operated at a higher level. And when they operated at a higher level, they would either ask questions or have an interest in things that made me realize how much I knew, even when I didn't even realize that I knew it. Sometimes teaching or answering someone's questions can be some of the best ways of like coming to that realization. As far as speaking to the formal education side of things, I think a lot of people put a lot of weight in that. But if you think of it this way, right? Like I had a concussion in my teens. I probably spent more time with endocrinologists than most people in medical school. I've also probably taken more nutrition classes than, or like nutritional certification seminars, total hours with the topic, total client hours, than a lot of doctors or specialists in that area. So when you combine my personal endocrine experience with nutrition, it kind of created this unique skill set that I didn't even really know that I was creating. So
Yeah.
just for those of you at home, like I didn't really set out to do this. I just like became aware of a lot of problems in this area, and like I wouldn't really wish it on anyone to basically, be in a doctor's office every month getting blood work done all the time. But if you think about it, every single time I had labs, I was reviewing them with a specialist. I was at Duke University being studied by both resident physicians and, the main head endocrinologist that was there. As a result of that, I had touch points with the material that some people, like I said, in medical school may have not even been exposed to until until their residency, if they were ultimately doing that. And so I never really like labeled myself as an expert. I actually don't even really like the term expert. I would go more with professional. Like if you want to call me a nutritional endocrinology professional, I think you're always seeking expertise. You're always trying to cultivate it. You're always trying to develop it. But that subject, the information can change at any time. And certainly I appreciate when other people call me that, but really I didn't even sort of see that for myself until a couple years ago. And then now I think it's just, it all comes back to like solving a problem and using my personal experience and leveraging that to help other people and sort of expedite that timeline for them. So, I always talk about like taking complex topics and using it as leverage for client goals, or using it for coaches as leverage for their clients' goals. And I think that's really where the impact is. But I can't say that I necessarily like set out to teach this. I didn't know, over 10 years ago that anything related to my health would ultimately benefit other people. Otherwise, like if I knew this was what I wanted to do, my both graduate and undergraduate experience might have looked a little bit differently. But definitely agree that sometimes we're kind of our own biggest obstacle or biggest barrier when it comes to our personal development, our career, and ultimately the path that we want to follow. And fortunately, I had people who were like, no, come on my podcast, talk about this, write an article for us about this. And a bunch of things sort of clicked last year for me. The LinkedIn event happened, T Nation publication happened. So Testosterone Nation, obviously, my article was kind of related to carbs and testosterone.
Yeah.
And then after that, several podcasts kind of landed significantly, and that was good. Fortunately, was able to serve as a contract instructor for Nutritional Coaching Institute, Jason Phillips. That was a really big opportunity. So sort of all of these things then allowed me to realize like, hey, do you actually like how much do you actually know? Because now you're in a position where you have to actually answer these questions and teach people.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, wow, I forgot that I knew this. And then kind of the ebook came around, and it was like, wow, I didn't realize I could write 70 pages about, nutrition, physiology, metabolism, and hormones. But ultimately, it was in my brain somewhere. So definitely very grateful for the mentors out there that I've had that allowed me to, and coaches, and the free information that's out there. And as much as I didn't enjoy it at the time, that experience with doctors and my own sort of medical and health transformation that gave me the quote unquote expertise or professionalism in that area that was sort of unexpected at the time.
Yeah. Dude, such a cool story. I just want to thank you for coming on and share with people how they can find you, how they can work with you, where to go, connect with you on social media, all the plugs right now.
Sure, I appreciate that. So, one of the best ways to get free information, obviously, podcasts like this. On Instagram, my handle is just Sam Miller Science. It's all one word. So my first name, my last name, and then the word science. I have the most boring generic name. Fun fact: first name not Samuel, just Sam. I've got no middle name, so I had to add the science there. There's a few friends that joke around about legally changing my name to that, but Sam Miller Science on Instagram. I do have the Hormone Blueprint ebook if you're interested in learning more about nutrition, training, lifestyle as it pertains to your physiology, teaching a little bit about that P3 model. If you're a coach, we have a free Facebook group called the Nutrition Coaching Collaborative. Great resource to pop in and get some free information. I also run 2 programs for coaches. One is the Applied Science Syndicate. It's 4 weeks long. And then the Applied Science Methods Mentorship, which is 12 weeks long. Both great ways to sort of begin to immerse yourself in some of these more advanced concepts beyond maybe what you learned in your initial training or nutrition certification. And as we discuss on the podcast, kind of going beyond just calories, sets, and reps and understanding the deeper layers of that. So I teach a lot about practices, perception, physiology, and ultimately how to reach our physical goals. Right now, for training and nutrition, we still have our oraclefitness.com website, but ultimately within, so it's August 2019 as we're recording this. By the end of the year, there will be a site, similarscience.com, for articles, resources, free information, and content. But in the meantime, definitely Instagram is kind of where I'm most active. And then we do have that, Facebook group as well for the coaches out there. Always happy to answer questions. I try to do stories and keep things pretty informative on there. So definitely reach out. Don't be a stranger. And thanks again for having me today, man. I really appreciate it.
Before I wrap this podcast up, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you got something out of it, I'm going to ask for two things. One, that you tag Sam and I on social media so that we can see who's listening. Two, leave a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Helps me get new guests on the show and helps me climb the chart so that more people can hear these messages. And last but not least, I want you to go have an awesome rest of your week. Take it easy.